everyone. Welcome. We're just letting people in, so there's still a couple of people sort of signing. I know people were coming from the plenary. My name is Lorgia García-Peña. I'm really excited to be here with you all today. This is the second roundtable on the topic of ethnic studies in the Ivy League today. And when I saw the panels and the ideas for the panels, I was struck by the energy around the question of ethnic studies, and in particular the question of what the role of the Ivy League is in the promotion of ethnic studies. I'm sorry, I'm a little bit distracted because there's a lot of people coming in. So I think.
Do you want me to? I'll take care of that. I'll just add them. Let me just admit.
I'm just wondering if maybe we should just give them 30 seconds, because I know the plenary was a bit late.
Yeah.
And so some people are still sort of running back from the plenary. So as we wait for people, hi Nelson, as we wait for people to sort of trickle in, maybe I can just go over some like logistical stuff. If you're not speaking, please turn your cameras off, and you can turn them back on when we do the Q&A so that it's more conversational, so that it's a little bit less confusing and we can just have only the speakers in view. If you're not speaking, again, also put your microphones on mute. There is, at the bottom of your screen, there should be a chat function where you can post questions. The idea of the roundtable is for it to be as conversational as possible. It's a bit of a big group, so we can use the hand raising function or whatnot, and I'll be moderating that at the end of the panel. We have 3 presenters and myself. Each of us are going to speak for about 5 to 10 minutes, and we'll share a little bit about our experiences and our thoughts, and then we're going to open it for discussion. And the idea is, again, really just to have an open conversation amongst the panelists, but also to give those of you who are present here the opportunity to ask questions, to share your own experiences, and to help us think through what ethnic studies is and means. So for me, I was approached by some colleagues from DSA earlier in the year about the possibility of putting together a conversation, thinking in part about what my experience has been as an ethnic studies scholar teaching in an Ivy League, and being involved in some of the movements both on the faculty and on supporting the student side over the past few years. And so I reached out to some of my favorite colleagues who are here, Anna, Francis, Jonathan, and some amazing students who unfortunately cannot be here today, and who are regretting not being part of the conversation, but who are sending their loves and their energy, and most likely will be able to watch the recording later or on a later time. And the idea was to think about together, first of all, what exactly is ethnic studies? I think for a lot of us, there's different meanings. For some of us, it's a site of knowledge. For some of us, it's a site of political movement. For some of us, it's an epistemology. For some of us, it's a framework. So it means many different things, but I think what we can all agree on is that it is a location for thinking against colonial and white supremacist frameworks of our institutions, and it's also a home for our students, especially our students of color. And I think those are two things that are in common in the way that all of us are thinking about ethnic studies in different institutions and geographically. What's particular about the Ivy Leagues, and in particular most of the Ivy Leagues that are represented by some of us present here, is also the geographies of it, right? Where most of us are located in the East Coast, and the history of ethnic studies movements in the East Coast is very different from what happened in the West Coast. So we'll be also thinking about what does the geography mean, and how that has shaped how schools, and in particular Ivy League schools, respond or not to student demands for ethnic studies. And I think the last question and the last inquietude that I think is guiding a lot of us here is, what is and has been the responsibility of Ivy League institutions and that have so much power, that tend to set the agenda for all of our scholarly engagements, particularly in the United States? What is the responsibility that they have to supporting students and faculty in their pursuit of ethnic studies scholarship and in creating spaces on campus? And how can we, as scholars working within this institution, demand those spaces and demand more fair and just engagement with these fields? So what we'll do is, again, I'll introduce briefly our speakers. We have Ana Ramos-Zayas, who's a professor of ethnicity, race, and migration at Yale. Then we have Francis Negrón-Muntaner, who's a professor of English and comparative literature at Columbia. And last but not least, el único hombre en el grupo, Jonathan Rosa, who is an associate professor of education, comparative race and ethnic studies, and anthropology and linguistics at Stanford University. So we'll go on that order. I'll pass the baton to you, Ana, and then Francis, Jonathan, and then we'll just open it up for discussion amongst the four of us. Thank you so much for all of you for being here. Ana.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Lorgia, for inviting us. This is just a real honor, and I'm so glad to be here with my panelists. I warn you that I live in New York City, right in the middle of Harlem, and you will hear a lot of noise, but hopefully my voice will come through. So I got to the Ivy League in a very long-term kind of way, and I just wanted to talk about that experience. I began my teaching career at Rutgers, a public state university in New Jersey, and I was there for about 10 years. Then I was at CUNY at the Grad Center and Baruch College for about 5 years, and then I got to Yale after that. And the reason why I want to talk about that trajectory is because it does make a huge difference to see how things are done in each of these spaces, and how it's definitely has its own distinct characteristics. So at Rutgers, I was hired in the anthropology department and in Latino, at the time it was called Puerto Rican and Latino Studies. Through the time there, we changed it, now it's Latino and Caribbean Studies, the department. It was one of the most productive, collegial, political, solidarious spaces I've ever been in. So my initial experience, the place where I got tenure, the place that where I went through all that, was a place where students and faculty were collaborating in creating a vision of what we wanted as a department. And in part, it was because there were very few people in the department. The department had grown in the 1970s through the struggles of the 60s and 70s, and it had that tradition, but the resources had been missing for a while. So we didn't have a lot of personnel, but we had a lot of community support from the New Brunswick community. We had a lot of support from alumni, Latinx alumni, and that shaped the experience there. The department currently is probably the best department in the Northeast, in the Mid-Atlantic region, I don't know. But it's just like, it was an exceptional place. I moved because of personal situations to a job in New York at Baruch College and the Graduate Center. And that was the opposite of that other experience. So that's why I don't want to like make it seem like these public places are, like these ideals. And then, so that was one of those places in which you felt very top-down controlled. They had really let the Department of Black and Latino Studies die. And so people are brought in to kind of revive the department, but it's a very top-down, dean-controlled kind of project. It's a project that really relies on getting rid of the political history and the political background on which these programs generally were built. And then finally at Yale, I had a lot of different kinds of perspectives before going there. But one of the things that I wanted to mention is that regardless of which one of these spaces we are, one of the things that doesn't change, at least in my case, has been the students. I've had the same demographically, just in every way, the same type of student in every one of those places, with the same levels of commitment as well. So this is one of those instances in which the department really is getting very the same demographically, the students, but the kind of engagements that students are encouraged to adopt and allowed to be part of are very different. Um, and I think that that's something that has characterized for me, ethnic studies in general. The fact that different programs have very different relationships with students, and incorporate students in very different ways. In 2015 was when there was a kind of like a big turn after decades of struggle, even in the ethnicity, race, and migration program at Yale, and students mobilized, and they were the ones that initiated some kinds of, just like structural and institutional changes that brought several other things. But in the end, Ivy League schools are just so good at regrouping like those changes and internalizing them and co-opting them, that I've always had trouble identifying the success there in a way that I never had at Rutgers. Like at Rutgers, I always saw the success of these programs. Whereas at Yale, it's become it's become harder to identify, and it feels like the struggles at Yale are struggles that are on an everyday sort of basis. It's struggles that feel isolated from a greater sense of structural change. Whereas at Rutgers, it all felt very organic. And in part is also because our students come from all over the country and all over the world. So we're not rooted in a community in particular, so not all of our students are from New Haven. Some of them are, but not all of them. So I've always wondered, how do we operate in these institutions? Because the institutions to work for us require that we do certain things their way. And is that something that would only make them work for us, but not generate any change? And I'm thinking here, for instance, in issues of tenure. Issues of tenure, in my opinion, the only way that these issues in the end will be resolved as they should is by operating through this legalistic system that is put in place by the very institution. So it's almost like using the institutional tools, legal tools, to counter, and looking at the loopholes of all of this in order to counter the denials of tenure of people. And that seems to be the way that they operate. So, but is that really changing the structure of tenure and how the work of people who go for tenure is evaluated? That's another story. So I want to, please let me know if I need to stop at any, when I need to stop. But I just wanted to put that question out there. Like, how do we make sure that the actions that we take within the institution are actions that in the end will really be more radical than they are liberal in a way? And I feel that certain place, or is it like the kind of thing that you say, well, if you're at an Ivy League school, you may as well just get used to it. It is what it is, and that's how it operates. You're not going to change something that is 300 years old and blah, blah, blah. How do we go beyond that, right? And how do we become effective in doing that? So one other thing that is interesting to me is the move from Latinx and Caribbean studies to an ethnicity, race, and migration program. And on the one hand, I really love the idea of being very comparative from an academic perspective, as well as in terms of the students that we get and the projects that they're into. And I feel that the ethnicity, race, and migration configuration allows for that in a very interesting kind of way. But it feels very academic in a way. With Latinx studies, at Rutgers is the Latino and Caribbean Studies department, I felt that the scope was deeper. I mean, there was a greater depth in terms of the conversations because there was already some historical and political economic common understandings that really facilitated those conversations. So I always think that maybe in part, the way that we related to our students and the way that change happened at Rutgers was facilitated because of that configuration in a way that maybe this other configuration makes it harder. So those are things that I've been really thinking about, and I always try not to like idealize my time at Rutgers and pretend that everything was great there. But the truth is that there is something very characteristic of the Ivy League that makes it feel like you should be grateful to be there, when in reality, most of the ethnic studies programs there are really lagging behind. I mean, compared to these other public programs, public university programs that have like just really dynamic faculties, incredibly involved students, and connections to the community that are very special and very unique. So that sort of dichotomy between the quality of the department and the expectations and self understanding of the institution is one thing that I feel like many of these ethnic studies programs are caught in between when they happen in the Ivy League. That idea that just because you are in a high name institution, you should be, you know, already like grateful just to be there. So I think I'm gonna stop here, but those are just some of the things that I have been thinking about, and I would love to hear input from everybody as we continue the conversation. Thank you.
Just jump in. All right. Well, I ended up writing because I want to read some things. First of all, I want to thank Lorgia, and I'm really thrilled to be here with everyone. When I started to think about what to say, and particularly in the very tight time frame, I thought there were several ways that I could address this question of ethnic studies and the Ivy League, at least in my experience from a particular institution at a particular moment. I ended up doing what I'm going to do, which is starting by juxtaposing these two documents that I received a few months apart. The first document was on July 21, 2020, in the midst of the Black Lives Matter protest. The president of my institution sent an official electronic communication to the university community to talk about race and racism. I'm just going to read one tiny piece of it because actually it's not so much what it says, but what it doesn't say. It says, scholarship on race and racism has long been deeply embedded across the university. The Institute for Research in African American Studies and the African American and African Diaspora Studies Department represent important centers of research, scholarship, and the university's commitment to doing battle with racism. Now, first, I should say that those two units should have definitely been mentioned in the communication. Yet, what struck me in there are many things that struck me in the communication, but I will highlight one. In a nearly 1,500 word missive on the state of teaching and research about race and racism at Columbia, the only ethnic studies unit, the Center for the Study of Ethnicity and Race, which had been serving the campus for over 20 years, was not mentioned at all. One of the two units mentioned had just been recently created. So that would be Exhibit 1. A few months later, last week, in fact, I received a blue envelope containing a thank you card written by a student that had recently graduated. And I want to read a little bit from that card. It says, I want to thank you for all your mentorship and support. I know I always tell you this, but your introduction to Latino studies was one of my most pivotal experiences at Columbia. I came to Columbia not knowing my purpose. I struggled with my Latino identity throughout high school, and I came to your class with the hope that I could learn a little more about myself. Your class, however, not only taught and instilled pride within me, but introduced me to the race and gender studies fields that I would not have encountered if it were not up for your class. Learning about the Young Lords and Chicano movement, especially the students' movement, inspired me to organize on campus. And I want to continue community organizing as I navigate my future path. Thank you so much for everything. The juxtaposition between is one way to describe, I think, ethnic studies at Columbia. On the one hand, overlooked, dismissed, erased. On the other hand, connecting, transforming, caring. So you could say, and it's interesting, Anna used the word in between or between, because I would say ethnic studies is a bit what happens in between those two experiences. Now, in the almost 20 years that I've been at Columbia, I've wondered many times why. Why does this happen? Could it be that the ethnic studies faculty does not work hard enough, or it's not good enough? That the program is small or lacks impact? I mean, these are some of the reasons people would normally give to a unit that's so drastically overlooked, underfunded, and undersupported. But I have to say, at Columbia, that's just not the case. You could definitely say there's not enough faculty, but the one that exists is excellent. The program over the last decade has more student demand than most humanities and social sciences programs. It also has more students by a lot than, let's say, the sister interdisciplinary programs. Our students become leaders in many fields. They're scholars, organizers, poets, filmmakers. Some have won MacArthur, so-called Genius Awards, and so forth. So none of the institutional type of explanation could really account for what happens. From 2009, and I'll tell you my hypothesis, from 2009 from 2016, I worked as the director of the Center for the Study of Ethnicity and Race. And I have to say that I worked really hard, helping to transform it into a more vibrant hub at the university and beyond. I worked at improving the infrastructure, like physical infrastructure, which was pretty much in disrepair. And sometimes I would bring my own drill to take down things from the walls. I won't say what things, so they can't come after me. The number of students during that period increased tenfold to more than 100. The number of people attending our programs increased to over 1,000. The number of people attending our parties, peaked at 400 at one occasion, right? Because we would bring live music to our parties. It got very famous. So basically, this place was starting to just not survive, but flourish, even within all the limitations of the environment. And it was becoming then a joyful, diasporic, decolonial, feminist, pluriversal, ethnic studies community. And I think that was it for my tenure. I wondered at a certain point whether succeeding was going to be the downfall of the whole process. And in some extent, and I won't get into all the details, but I can address later, I think that was to some extent the case. What is the fear exactly? I think the fear is that it's a different formation than exists would become generalized. And this is where it's very important to remember that the Center for the Study of Ethnicity and Race at Columbia is the only unit at Columbia formed by a student strike in 1996. And though no subsequent strike has succeeded in expanding the resources of the center since its founding in 1999, it does remain as a symbol of student power and of different relationships across the university in different ways, subjects of knowledge, of governance, the relationship that people develop with, among each other and between professors and students. So this, in some ways, to make the center invisible is to also render all of the above, if not impossible, but a lot harder. So what to do? It's a difficult question because it rests on a certain paradox. And I mentioned a little bit of this. So we are making demands on an institution that would prefer ethnic studies really didn't thrive and maybe not even exist. But at the same time, some of us have reservations about how much incorporation would be desirable, because then you would get ensnared in these logics that our work works counter. So returning in a way to my students' text, I just want to leave you with some action verbs that I think are some of the ways that I work as an ethnic studies practitioner at Caesar and at Columbia, which is I want to work on surprise. I want to work on redefinition, on relating, on building, and fighting, but sometimes fleeing. And of course, love and leveraging the resources to make very different things possible for now and for later, which ultimately is what we want institutions for. So not every generation has to create the foundations for its own existence. So I'll leave it at that, and happy to come back to any of it later.
Okay, I'll just jump in and share a few comments here. First, it's wonderful to have the opportunity to be in dialogue with you all and to be participating in the Dominican Studies Association conference. I think as a Puerto Rican participating in the Dominican Studies Association conference, alongside actually several other Puerto Ricans in this roundtable, questions about solidarity and the work that we do in solidarity with one another are front and central to me in our discussions of ethnic studies and the ways that solidarity is in some cases made very difficult because of the ways that institutions organize and structure ethnic studies and pit populations against one another. So, and fights for resources. And so I want to think through that with all of you. But I'll say a few things, I think, echoing a lot of what Francis and Ana have already pointed out. So first of all, because I'm at Stanford right now, Stanford is not technically an Ivy League institution, but an elite institution, of course. And prior to Stanford, I was a faculty member at the University of Massachusetts, Amherst. And so a trajectory somewhat akin to what Ana was describing in terms of Rutgers and Yale. But I guess I would say the program at Rutgers is very different, and the department at Rutgers is very different from the infrastructure that was available at UMass. So when I arrived as a faculty member at UMass in anthropology, within anthropology, we taught native studies, but there were no Latino studies courses formally. There was no introduction to Latino studies or Latinx studies at UMass at the time, and this was in 2011. But I said, okay, so anthropology teaches native studies. Why can't I teach intro to Latino studies within anthropology? And so they allowed me to do that. And that kind of ad hoc creative reworking, or the arguments that you can make about sort of making a case for ethnic studies when there's not an existing structure, that was a space that was available in that moment. What I didn't understand as a sort of a new assistant professor on the tenure track was the systematic way in which that under-resourcing happens, so that it wasn't by chance that there wasn't this kind of a course and that I would have to create this sort of workaround, so that when I arrived at Stanford, which has a program, a formalized program in so-called Chicano Latino studies, and then we can talk about the regional sorts of issues involved in foregrounding Chicanidad or Chicano experiences here in California. There's a formal program where students could get their degrees in Chicano Latino studies, and yet there are no faculty, there's no intro course. And so when I arrived at Stanford I was hired in 2015, and one of the first things I said was, and I was hired into the Graduate School of Education, but I said, I would like to teach intro to Latinx studies or Latino studies. And they said, the director at the time said, oh my gosh, we've never had a tenure stream faculty member teach our intro course. That's just not something that's ever happened. And what we find at many of these institutions is that diplomas are being handed out, or programs are in existence where there are no faculty whatsoever, which in deeply under-resourced institutions and public institutions, you can in some ways understand how resource allocations play out in ways that would in some ways, I guess, make that, I don't want to say understandable, but at least you can make sense of it on some level. At a place like Stanford, those kinds of resource issues and challenges are just not the case at all. So, when a diploma is being handed out where there's no faculty to offer an intro course, there's no intellectual substance, but they'll put this degree on a diploma, that's intellectually and politically, the ethics of that, need to be considered. And so I want to think about how we get to this place. I guess part of what I wanted to discuss a little bit is the way that, for me, ethnic studies in a conversation about ethnic studies in the Ivy League is quite fraught. You say, okay, what could the Ivy League possibly do, but simply, what could we make use of in the Ivy League other than its resources, and then, redirect them, reallocate them to communities, rather than focusing on building things within the Ivy League, which will inevitably reproduce the very kinds of hierarchies that ethnic studies is designed in some ways to interrogate. But I don't want to undermine the extent to which the institutionalization of ethnic studies also holds some potential. And I want to be open to that possibility, while also be, remaining deeply wary of what happens when you institutionalize these spaces. So for me, whether when I was at UMass or now at Stanford, a lot of my ethnic studies work has been focused on campus, but also off campus. So at UMass, I was working with the creation of ethnic studies programs in local K-12 schools, training teachers and administrators to administer those programs and working directly with students. And now in California, we're working with California public schools as well around their institutionalization of ethnic studies. And so for me, you know, it's crucial not to just think of this as living or a debate that lives or could be resolved within the university itself. In terms of concrete things that are going on in these programs, some of the struggles for me involve just fundamental under-resourcing and again, the pitting of populations against each other. And when we're having really fraught dialogues about the ways that various kinds of hierarchies exist within different ethno-racial groups and the ways that power is organized among different populations, to see that play out institutionally when the very people who should be working in solidarity with one another or could be working in solidarity with one another are instead looking at one another to figure out why they have more resources, why one group has more resources than another, which again, I think in some cases prevents people from struggling together. And the disparities are outrageous in different institutional settings. I mean, so you have some cases where you have long-standing investments in the analysis of particular kinds of experiences and fundamental, just a complete ineptitude around other populations' experiences. And so, you know, how we can work in solidarity with one another to address that and to understand that the under-analysis of particular populations disserves all of us, of particular marginalized populations disserves all of us. And so how do we hold each other accountable is one of the questions. In terms of this issue that has come up around tenure, and what at Stanford, what that becomes is a debate about departmentalization, which especially our students in African-American and African studies at Stanford have done incredible work, our graduate students and our undergraduate students, to essentially create a department without a department. So they have been training themselves, creating their own, the Black students at Stanford have created a Black studies, an ad hoc Black studies program. And, you know, again, you don't want to, I think, as Ana was pointing out, I don't want to romanticize what happens in these spaces. You know, I want to honor the power of the work that comes out of these spaces that are parallel spaces outside of the institution or that the institution hasn't sanctioned, while also trying to think about what happens when you make demands on departmentalization. And that's one of the biggest challenges we're facing right now, figuring out whether we should be advocating for the departmentalization of programs that are focused on specific ethno-racial populations, whether we should be thinking about an overarching comparative program or critical ethnic studies program, or whether we should be framing this work in terms of political commitments around abolition, decolonization, rather than conceptual issues, comparative conceptual issues around diaspora and migration. And so, you know, part of where I kind of leave off with things is deeply concerned. And I think some of what Francis is saying, I mean, it's almost identical. Francis, when you mention these institutional statements that are released, where the programs that have been struggling around different issues for decades are completely ignored in those initiatives. And it becomes clear that the administration is willing to redesign or completely restructure something on a dime, or just, you know, in somewhat casual or again, ad hoc ways. It's concerning. And right now that's where we are at Stanford, where it's clear that our administration is actually willing to departmentalize in certain ways. But I think many of us who are participating in this dialogue are concerned about that sudden willingness since March 2020, when, you know, racism started. And so this question around what happens in this moment when people are suddenly talking about an issue and seeing this as a possibility, I also am worried about the quick moves that people are trying to make right now, and whether those moves are extending and building on long-standing histories of intergenerational struggle, so that we don't create something that actually undermines our broader efforts. And that's part of what we're grappling with. I guess the very last thing I'll say is this. One of the things I'm trying to deal with at Stanford is, do we even want a department if this is a faculty that hasn't been advocating for it? Our faculty haven't collectively advocated. We don't have people the students are organizing and mobilizing. And so if we create a department where there ultimately isn't the faculty, a politicized faculty, and in Ivy League schools, which function as country club spaces where you have a whole plantation politics, a pigmentocratic politics, which is outrageous in these spaces in many cases. You know, a colorist politics, there's so much going on in these spaces where the very people who could be the faculty who are expected to sustain these programs are in fact politically ill-equipped to do so. And so grappling with advocating institutionalization, but also really kind of thinking about the limitations of this in different spaces. So I'm excited for the collective dialogue that we have among the roundtable participants and the audience here. Thank you.
Thank you to everyone. It was really amazing just hearing each of you, because the whole time while I'm looking at the screens, because for the four of us, and we're all just kind of going, yep. So the way in which so much of what was said resonates with our own experiences, with our own trajectories, and I just kind of wanted to summarize, because people were trickling in throughout the presentation, that some of the things, some of the points that all of us, all of you brought together was things like solidarity is central to the work that we do in ethnic studies. Ethnic studies is always working anti, or what I would call in contradiction to the university, and therefore, do we really want to institutionalize it? What would it mean to institutionalize ethnic studies? Would it mean to dilute it? We always know that ethnic studies come from students. It comes from student demands, and it's a shame that we don't have our really, badass students that were going to be here. But COVID-19 has really taken a toll on our students, and this is also part of the conversation. Their parents are dying, their parents are sick, and they're taking care of little siblings, or they're dealing with things that are literally beyond their years, and that's why they can't be here, which is also part of this conversation in many ways. There's a need to link to a community. We know that ethnic studies came from student demands, but it also responded to an energy of what was happening outside of the university. And Jonathan brought that question again. I mean, how do we think about ethnic studies in our institutions, while also remembering that this is not only about our institutions? And then there's the question of accountability. How do we keep each other and the institutions accountable for the work that we are trying to do? And then there is practical things, like the kinds of demands that students are having at Stanford. Who's teaching us? Jonathan was talking about you go through an entire program and degrees, and you never have a faculty member, someone on a tenure track. That is the same at Harvard. During my years here, when I arrived, there was no program of any kind in Latino studies. I created a major, a minor, and a graduate certificate. But I was literally the walking and talking Latino studies program. There was never anyone hired, and I'm still the only Latino studies scholar in the entire Faculty of Arts and Sciences. Meanwhile, the graduate program has 24 graduate students. That's more than the Italian program. That's more than the dance program. And somehow that's on the books. People looking at the catalogs see it and think we actually have a program. We don't have a program. We have one person who was on tenure and is on her way out, and we have 24 students who are going to be left without an advisor. And so the solutions that the institutions come up with are ridiculous and laughable. Things from, going through the roster of people with last names that are Spanish, and I'm not joking, and inviting them into rooms and saying, could you take over the Latino studies? And they might say something like, but I'm a biology professor. I don't know what the fuck this is. So there is all of this crazy stuff that goes on in the Ivy Leagues, and you have the image, right? And you have the programs that are created, and you have the success that Ana was talking about, this idea of measuring success by the number of students who graduate. But when you look at the program itself, and when you look at what's happening to the students and to the faculty teaching in these programs, it's typically one or two of us, some temporary labor, hiring adjuncts, hiring for recently graduate PhDs who were not able to get a job elsewhere, bringing them in for the year, calling them a postdoc and making them teach for classes. And so it's labor exploitation of faculty, and it's deceitful, engañando, no? So these are all these things that are happening at the same time. And yet, what makes it particularly infuriating, and Martha Ellen Davis had a question about the difference between the private versus public, and what makes it infuriating about this elite institution is that there is no money problem. The money is there. So the question is not, we don't have the budget, is we don't want to do that, which is what Francis was talking about, right? We do not want to recognize that this work and this labor and these demands from students, we don't want to recognize that students know better. what they need for their education. And so there is this constant power struggle. So I want to open it up first to the panelists in case you guys you have questions for each other, and then open it up. I'll be reading questions off the chat, but also you may raise your little hand and just speak. I just ask that please don't ask questions that are very lengthy so that we have enough time to actually get to an answer. So just either raise your hand or post a question in the chat. In the meantime, Jonathan, Ana, and Francis, feel free to jump in with follow-ups and questions.
I just wanted to like what you just said, because I think Jonathan and I were nodding. I mean, the fact that a lot of times these programs are presented in a way that doesn't reflect that they're like just like they just like the piece. I had the word in my mind, but like just un esqueleto, no, como un esqueleto. Like it doesn't have like the flesh, right? It's just like they have the bare minimum, like literally the bare minimum of these programs, and that students can still say that they have had that program in their education, or that they can just show off as a PR scheme for the university, that whenever they need to show up what they have succeeded in doing in terms of inclusion and like all these other, you know, they will parade it. And I think it's unbelievable that they can get away with it, because especially when you know, it's like, who are you talking about here? Who exactly? Where is the faculty? Where is the tenure track faculty? Where are the tenure track searches? Why are those the first ones to get stopped? And so yeah, I mean, I just wanted to echo that, because it's fascinating in some really tragic way. I mean, the fact that you can be talking about something as if it were there, and it really is the labor of like one person or two people that is generating everything that stands, for the university to then take credit of what's going on. So yeah.
I have a question from Raj Chetty while you all think of other questions. How are your universities navigating the diversity, inclusion, equity? And then he goes, I think I started to answer the question as I was typing in, Ana, alongside instead of this interdisciplinary formation. So how are universities handling diversity, inclusion, and equity alongside ethnic studies? That's always a fascinating and infuriating dynamic.
Well, I would say that at Columbia over the last few years, when the university felt increasingly that they had to do more about diversity, and as a result of pressures from multiple sides, so not inherently, but I think what happened was that there was a paradoxical thing that happened. Before that moment, ethnic studies unit and related units would be doing some of the work that technically sits beyond it as an academic unit. So it was mentoring, it was doing community, some things with the community and so forth. But when this shift began, what I saw as very paradoxical is that in some ways, these units were released from that they were doing, but now it was concentrated and much more controlled from above. And in the last few months since the Black Lives Matters protest, if you read the entire 1,500-word email, you will see any number of initiatives that include recruitment, that include new projects, new funds, none of which include strengthening ethnic studies units. It includes, however, as I think Jonathan mentioned, reinforcing or giving more resources to other units, but not ethnic studies. I think in that landscape, I would say ethnic studies would be the most marginalized of all the potential spaces to nurture. And I think it has to do with its history and what it represents.
Absolutely.
I just wanted to jump in on this point too. I should say the latest acronym that has disturbed me profoundly is JEDI. So Justice, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion is.
Oh, Jesus Christ.
So here we are. But this kind of corporate PR branding strategy and the reduction or the assumption that ethnic studies corresponds to that or should be an arm of that is part of what's so profoundly upsetting. So you're sitting alongside colleagues who have read nothing in any of these fields and whose work you're poised to pull the rug out from under in any given moment by drawing on insights from ethnic studies, who are then tasked by the provost and administrative actors to participate in committees to figure out the future what ethnic studies is, because ethnic studies is imagined as a diversity initiative, not an intellectual project. And what's tricky about that is then it recruits us to double down on the intellectual content of ethnic studies rather than the political commitment of ethnic studies. And so here I find myself in this situation where it recruits me to position different kinds of ethnic studies insights as these gotcha sort of party tricks that I can use to show why anthropology is limited, sociology is limited, political science, literature, all of the mainstream disciplines, rather than kind of saying, wait a second, ethnic studies is doing really important intellectual work in its own right, not just as a gotcha and not just as public relations. So the conflation of DEI work, corporate kind of DEI work, and ethnic studies is quite troublesome.
I mean, except I would say that at Columbia, that's not even it's like one step earlier than that. But you made me remember another thing that was quite remarkable that happened recently, which was the announcement that Columbia will now be engaged in what it's called the fourth purpose. And the fourth purpose means that the university is trying to have impact in the world. And these are the kinds of extraction, if you will, of some of the foundations of areas like ethnic studies into a new vocabulary that is now operating from a different part of the university for very different ends.
Unbelievable. I have a question from Alondra Garcia, and says, it's been my personal observation that most of what has been achieved in ethnic studies across the Ivy League has been achieved through student, undergraduate, and graduate activism aided by individual professors. Is this a multi-school history, one that students themselves know, or are students having to relearn all lessons? And let me remind the audience that you're welcome to raise your hands and unmute yourself and turn your camera on to ask your questions. It's a little bit more personal than using the chat, since we actually have the time to do that. Anyone wants to answer, Albert? Otherwise I can.
That is just, it's a great question. I mean, I feel that whenever I've spoken with an alum from the 70s or something, they're baffled. They're like, what? Like we're doing exactly that struggle back in our day, you know? And it just feels like some of these are repeated, but I don't know if it's necessarily that students are not aware of these generational efforts. I think people are aware of them, and it feels that for whatever reason, the efforts are very fragile, and whatever is achieved, it is achieved in a way that doesn't guarantee any kind of longevity for that particular thing. So it's constantly reinventing the wheel, and it does get that feel. And even when we have quite a bit of progress in an area, you think back globally and it's like, wow, we are exactly now where we were 20 years ago. Now that we got these 2 lines, we're finally back at the same, you know, and it's that constant sense of being like catching up and in our own goals. And, you know, I think that there are a lot of excuses that universities make for this, you know, and it is hard to get out of that. It's like, how do we get past that? And how to make can we get to a point where we can make our goals other goals rather than just trying to meet what we already wanted to meet like 20 years ago? It's really,
I mean, this question of reproduction, I mean, I feel like Columbia, the main site of reproduction for the history of the student movement happens in at least when the times I teach it, and I think when other people teach it, the introduction to comparative ethnic studies is the space where your students learn, perhaps for the first time at large. I'm not saying there might be a population of students who are activists that become activists and access and look for this information because they need it. But the bulk of the majority of the students that learned that this happened and how it happened and any perspective about it generally learn it in the introduction to comparative ethnic studies. I would have to say that is a very fragile, as you say, reproduction mechanism. About 10 years ago, there was a strike at Columbia. And I learned something incredible, which is that the students on strike were making demands about things that they already had. And for instance, they were making a demand for participating in committees of recruitment for faculty, which was already something that Caesar did regularly. And the second thing I have to say about the complexity of this is that during my tenure at Caesar, when the strike was happening afterwards, we had a meeting, a lot of the student leadership and Caesar faculty that attended. And I asked them, okay, so in many ways, the strike didn't achieve a lot of its objectives, but what can we do? What would you like this space to do? Mm-hmm. And that question was followed by about 45 minutes of silence. And what I learned from that was that to many students, including the ones that wanted to support Caesar and ethnic studies at Columbia, the space was a cause. It was more a symbol of what was wrong at so many levels, rather than an actual viable space to do work. And that's one of the reasons I spent a lot of my tenure as director of Caesar making it a space where people wanted to work and wanted to then get out what you're saying, Anna, about getting out from just trying to meet these goals that we've had for like 20 years that we can't ever meet, and redefining what we mean by success and redefining what is it that we want to do with the resources that we have and the relationships that we have, and we can expand. So it's very, it's complicated, I would say. There's not a lot of ways that are set for these dialogues to occur and to be able to have intergenerational production.
And Albert, I don't know, in my almost decade at Harvard, I've already seen what you're describing. Sort of this, generation of students. Typically, the first year students are not the one leading the struggle. By the time they get sort of radicalized, if you will, they're juniors. And then they put all of that energy and then they graduate and they go. And so there is a great deal of reinventing the wheel that is happening, and the universities know this. They know this and they bet on it. And so what I've seen at Harvard is a lot of sort of buying time, telling students long stories. We're going to do a search. We're going to do it in April. Students are going to graduate in May, and ciao. And so there is a lot of sort of being aware that the students, that the generations of students who are activists is going to change every year. That even if there is a way in which they can know the history, it takes a while for them to sort of build a coalition over and over. And they really are. I think the universities really play on that and are counting on that, on the fact that it is a short period of time, a period of about 2 years in which student activism happens, and they're counting on that. What I've seen with Yale and Harvard students now is that they're working with alumni a lot. And so the Ethnic Studies Coalition, both at Yale and Harvard, are really active, and their recent graduates, these are not people who graduated in the 70s, but rather people who graduated 5-6 years ago, who are still kind of burned by what happened, who still remember the promises that were made, and I'm watching closely and saying, wait, didn't you say you were going to hire people like 5 years ago? Are we still not doing that? Are you still not tenuring faculty? So there is a little bit more of an engagement, but there is a lot that is lost in that interim between sort of graduation and the new generation of students becoming aware of what is happening, just learning the lay of the land. And not to mention that the majority of ethnic studies students are first generation students, for whom navigating the Ivy League is very, very difficult. So by the time they even find their tribe, which they usually find it in our classes, not even in a center, but by taking the Intro to Latino Studies class or the Intro to Ethnic Studies class, that's where they meet each other. By the time they sort of find their community, they have a year and very little can happen.
And they also have a lot of pressures because as first generation, they have all that weight. And I've had students come to me saying, I have to graduate, or this whole family investment of many, many years will go nowhere, right? So that's the other layer of it.
Yeah, and a lot of them, ethnic studies is their minor or their second major, precisely because they must get that medical degree or law degree. They have to do that. Their families are counting on that. They can't go home and say, my major is ethnic studies, because that will not be recognized as valuable by their parents. So we can take more questions. Omaris, do you want to go online and ask your question?
Oh, I was just commenting on what, oh my God, I still have the virtual background from yesterday. I'm a hot mess. Anyway, excuse me.
Don't
But yes,
worry.
I was just echoing what you were saying about I just feel like there's always this lack of institutional resources for first-gen students, like so many, right? First-gen students of color at these institutions. I was one of them, right? And now as a faculty, I'm always thinking about how can I best support, right, these students? What do I need to do, right? What did I need? And it's, you know, it's always a sense of like, okay, listening to our students and asking them what they need, right? Because a lot of times, back to that moment of silence where the students don't know what to respond when you ask them, what do you need? Sometimes they don't even know that they can ask you something, right? Yeah, and I think that's very common, even when they stop being students and they start being first gen faculty. It's like, oh, I didn't even know I could ask for that, right? So I think that is something that I always wonder, right? Like, what can we do, and how can we do it better? But I mean, obviously, we need to hold our institutions accountable. But yeah, that's just, I was just echoing what everyone was saying. And thank you to everyone who's here.
Thank you. April has her hand up. April,
Can you hear me?
we can hear you.
Thank you. Muchísimas gracias. And Jonathan, also calling in from the West Coast. I'm at Pomona College. And I don't know what I'm trying to say with this, except echo a lot of what's been said. But I will say this, that part of, you know, what we're losing out because we're in this constant entrenched struggles for just survival is missing out on engaging some conversations where we need people with critical ethnic studies knowledge to engage. And one specific area is the whole notion of academic freedom. When we're so entrenched in these battles, we're not in the battles around explaining to people why particular demands about how students are treated in classrooms is not an infringement on your right to speak or academic freedom. And, you know, we're in this constant conversation here at Pomona, but because we're in the survival mode always, you know, that's like one more thing to add to our to-do list, which A, isn't fair, but B, is also, you know, that's what we need. The second thing I would say that I'm beginning to understand is or I don't know who the we is in this, so forgive me, but there has to be a discourse change that ethnic studies is not an add-on, but it is the epistemological framework that will help us build the future, period. And it is also a competency for a future that is non-white. It is a competency skill. Critical ethnic studies theories, critical ethnic studies methodologies, critical ethnic studies epistemologies is how we are going to answer the questions of the world. That's how we are going to answer COVID and understand its impact on so many levels. And so, but again, because we're in survival mode, we're often defensive and trying to just justify ourselves, whereas we need to demand that more and more people have critical ethnic studies ideas as a skill set when they come in to lead at various levels of the institution. And my final point is, and this goes back to a point Francis made, so much of what our interdisciplinary ethnic studies programs and departments and faculty and staff and students have brought to the institutions have now been institutionalized in things like community engagement, in things like recruitment to get 25% Pell students, in things like recruitment of first-gen students, in things like diversity, equity, and inclusion, deans, and what have you. Although I don't think that was ever a demand of ours, but you know, we'll just keep it that. And I want us to be cognizant or aware of what the next institutionalization framing will be after this bout of virtual teaching. Because let me tell you, I thought I lived in the frickin' Twilight Zone this entire summer when we were being trained to move our courses online. Y finalmente, people were talking about student-centered teaching. People were talking about care and ethics of care in teaching, particularly in this time of COVID and as we're moving online. And I'm like, and these people have no idea that 30 years of research have been done by various ethnic studies scholars about these same topics. We were ready to go with virtual teaching and no one gave us credit. And what's going to happen? What will be institutionalized as a result of that? That will again erase our history and erase our contributions. And that's it.
April, you made a comment on the chat about withholding labor. Would you mind saying a little more about that?
Oh, I don't think that was me.
Oh, no? I'm
No.
sorry. I am not great at this, at the multitasking of what somebody made a comment about how do we respond to I guess to the disavowal and of our faculty from of ethnic studies from the Ivy League, and somebody responded we should be thinking about withholding our labor, and it just made me, this is something that I've been hearing quite a bit from colleagues across the US.
We actually implemented the withholding the labor. So I would like just to
yeah, just to finish, they were referring to people outside of the institutions. So how we're, like, for instance, if things like not writing letters of recommendation, not reviewing tenure, dossier, and so on, because all of these institutions don't exist in isolation. They're also going to be needing faculty from outside. So how do we build solidarity that way? And I'll let you answer and share what you did. Yeah.
Yeah, that was a different part of the question. I mean, I was thinking of like actually withholding when you're in, but this is, I go back and forth on this. I mean, my of course they know that they have us, like that's one of the ways in which I feel very trapped, right? Because I'm purposely selective in how I contribute to writing letters and all of that, and they just mean a lot to me to be able to do that. And I just wonder, I mean, yeah, I just wonder about the logistics of it, or I guess how that will work and who's gonna really pay for it. But yeah, I mean, I didn't want to necessarily comment on this. I'll just leave it here because I haven't thought too much about it, quite frankly, just for fear of what our students and the people that are being promoted will end, and who will end up writing those letters, because somebody will.
One of that question of what to do is one that I ask myself a lot, because being in a certain place for a long time, I've seen how neither success nor demands seem to move the needle, and in part it's because the faculty doesn't push hard enough, or doesn't. There's like a limit where it won't go further than that. I mean, that's part of it. So I wonder, what happened at Yale in solidarity with a colleague around a tenure denial would be very difficult to envision in a place like Colombia. So I just wondering, because in some of the things that I didn't say that I was thinking about. So what are the options? So you got withdrawal of labor within or without. You have creating certain kind of critical mass to make and creating alliances, because I can tell you that the only options that I had sometimes as director was going with an alliance of people from other units that had significantly more weight within from the point of view of the administration and I only got just a hearing. I didn't really get action. If those other units had gone asking or what I had gone to ask for, they probably have gotten very different results. So that's something that I'm interested. I don't know if anybody can talk a little bit more about what are those strategies to get Ivy League faculty, which in a place like Colombia, which is a star system. So it's not only the issue of who gets what, the questions of Jonathan was talking about that undermine solidarity. It's also a star system, everybody for their own, on their own. You're pulling towards you to advance your career. So the we is very difficult.
Yeah, I agree. It's the same. Columbia is very similar to Harvard in that sense, where we didn't have the the critical mass, the number of tenure faculty that Yale had to support Albert when my tenure was denied. So the other two faculty were my junior. So who, the solidarity had to come from outside.
So it's different that at Yale there's more people. Is that the
well,
main?
there's more people, but also I mean from what you're saying, I mean there are more people for sure, but it's also, I think it's also that there were some actual labor loopholes that needed to be caught, and I bet that if we examined how these universities are set up, those loopholes are probably everywhere. And one of those loopholes was that we were hired in 2 departments without being given any credit for the work that we did in the other department, right? So it was all this thing of like, wait a second, but we're really not hired as part of ERNM, but we are the ones running ERNM. We're the ones teaching all the classes, because our main hire was in their American studies, anthropology, political science, or whatever. And so finally, when we realized, and ERNM, by the way, is one of the top majors as well. I mean, we're not talking about a little 5 people. We're talking about it's in the top 11, I think, or around there in the university. So if we decide we're quitting, which we did submit our resignation letters, somebody needs to take on the classes that we were teaching for that department. Somebody needs to do the advising. Somebody needs to be the DUS and all these other things. So in that part, they jump very quickly for any fear of actual legal repercussion, because they had messed up. I mean, they're so used to screwing people in a sense that we need to make sure that we know how we're being screwed, and if there are different kinds of ways that we can fight back that can do that. But I realize that each one of these institutions, even though they're all very, very elite, they probably each has their own idiosyncrasy and their own way of operating. So I realized that it would not work for everybody. And we saw that in the case of Lorgia. I mean, like, that was one of those cases in which if it had happened at Yale, probably we would have stepped in like we did, right? So we would have stepped in and there would have been a different, because there was a mass of people that could do that. And by the way, and it was because also it was a mass of people that were tenured. Many were full faculty. So that's another thing about talking about that kind of privilege and what to do with that. But yeah, it's weird because I hadn't realized that we had it so good, to be honest. Like, I mean, we're always in like the struggle. And now I'm like, oh my God, I have like 14 people that sit with me at a meeting. That's just like unbelievable. But yeah, it's
Beth Manley has her hand up. Beth.
Yeah, thanks. I just wanted to thank you all for this incredible, thoughtful, important discussion. And I wanted to kind of touch on something that Jonathan said, that the danger of quick moves, right, at this particular moment. I work at Xavier University, which is a HBCU, and also the only Catholic HBCU, right? And for many reasons, of which I'm sure you all could, sort of figure out yourselves, there has not been a major in African and African diaspora studies at the university ever. And through a complicated system, we just got $500,000 from Mellon to create one. The irony is thick, right? And yet we also just created a Center for Equity, Justice, and the Human Spirit. And we have a social justice mission, right? And so all of this, right, I want to get on board with all of this. And it's both the center and the, new funded major are things that I support. But I also kind of want to think through what it means to do that at this moment in a way that gives credit to the institution. Oh, look at our fancy Mellon grants, right? And not, and work towards the creation of community with students and finding ways to convince first-gen students that they could also major, right, in an African diasporic studies program, or however gets named. We shall see that fight later. you know, that they can also do those things and support the kinds of needs that they have and figure out how to get them to ask the kinds of questions that of things they need, right? And I think I really appreciate that that you talked about this, that we need to consider the very particularities of this moment and who is getting credit for the kinds of successes that are happening. And also, how do we break this idea that there's a one pie and there's only so much for everyone, right? And I think that's super important. So thank you.
Lorgia, you're muted.
Of course I am. Thank you. We have about 4 more minutes for questioning. I see that Albert, you have your hand up. So if you want to quickly ask your question, and then we'll just, any concluding remarks that you all have, we'll say at the end.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, as someone who worked as a student, you know, whatever, 20, 25 years ago, and it's both like, it's both sad to hear the same things going on, right? And in some ways it also, there's a lot of hope and optimism, because I feel like that there was like a 10-year stretch at some point where I asked, like, where are all the academics doing things? Where are the academics that we've had? And I really feel like in the last, especially the last 7 to 8 years, maybe because it's social media, maybe it's kind of that there is certainly a sense of greater, I think, movement activism as people are moving into spaces. And so I guess my question is, and I think that as students, we looked at what Harvard was doing, we looked at what Cornell was doing, like we were in constant contact with the students who took over. You know, like in '96, we knew exactly what happened to the students at Princeton in 95, and when they took over their things, right? So I think there was a sense of solidarity across schools that enabled us. But each of these institutions, as Anna was saying, like, there's a certain reason why we were pushing for things at Columbia, because it was very Columbia-centric, right? We knew that those things would not happen at Harvard. And it's ironic to hear, because I remember the students at Harvard coming down in '96 saying, well, when do we get our chance? How do we have to do it? So it's interesting to see those things. So my question is, like, how do we build on this moment? What do you guys need, first of all, as faculty, right? Speaking as an alumnus, right? Like, what do you guys need as faculty to build on this moment? Also understanding that these student activists will become alumni, right? And they have their own, will have their own issues, right? Like our journey as activist alumni was interesting after those years, right? Which is probably a panel for itself. But what do we do to build upon this current moment? What do you guys need specifically, I would say, especially from like alumni of these institutions who may actually not like these institutions anymore once they get their degree, but certainly like the programs and the faculty members?
Well, one thing, I mean, I've been, particularly when I was director of CSAR, I got asked many times to talk to alumni that were involved in the creation of the center, particularly. And one of the things that I saw was that that the alum, just like there was commentary earlier about first generation students not knowing what to demand. I think there's also alumni that are linked to these programs and these processes are also not that sure about what is it that their power is, or don't, I guess, maximize their power. So one of the things that I see is potentially useful is to have more conversations, maybe even independent from the official ones, because I can say that some of these that I've been to have been monitored, you know, heavily monitored. So I would say independent, like let's look for spaces where we can talk and design and conditions perhaps, or ways that the alumni will be particularly interested in investing in Colombia when certain things are met. And solidarity could be kind of baked into that. So instead of just saying we only want to support this, we want to support projects and programs that work together, for instance, would be one avenue. So you're saying we want support, but we don't want to continue isolating the units. For instance, I think that would go a long way. And just seeking and creating spaces for that conversation to happen that's not only brokered by development.
Thank you so much, everyone. We are officially out of time. This has been a wonderful conversation. I want to thank Ana and Francis and Jonathan, especially for being here with me today and sharing your experience. And of course, all of you for joining us. There are more amazing panels coming the rest of the evening. And on the chat, there are links to the next round. So feel free to pick one and join and listen to the conversations. And thank you again to all of you for being here.
Thank you.